So one of my absolute favorite places to be is in the mountains. I've only had the great gift of being able to go to the Rockies once, but thankfully I get to go back in August. Most of my experiences have been in the Appalachians, but I have to say there are few places more serene and relaxing for me than going on backpacking trips, because not only are you in the mountains, but you get away from all the people around you. It's very quiet and peaceful. And one of my favorite places to be while I'm hiking is to take a break and kind of sit by a stream and just listen to the water flowing over the rocks. That very relaxing sound. And I remember one day I was really reflecting upon the stream and the whole, why it flows the way it does. Why does it take this path and not that path? Well, and as I was sitting to reflect, I realized that the water always chooses the easiest path down the mountain. It always chooses the path that can get down to meet up with that bigger stream down in the valley the quickest. And that kind of reality of always seeking the easiest path towards a goal is something that all of us can sometimes fall into, isn't it? But the challenge of today's gospel from Christ does not in any way allow for us to be that stream and take that easy way down the mountain. Because Jesus does not tell us, don't worry, do what you want, everything's going to work out in the end. Nor does he even say, you know what, if you're only good enough, it's fine, don't worry. He actually gives us a very high challenge today, doesn't he? Be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. And he really emphasizes that statement by giving us three very striking examples that are very challenging for us as we read them. And of course, we have to understand them in their proper context to realize the deeper meaning that Christ is calling us to today. And the first is one that many of us are familiar with, the whole turn the other cheek. Well, of course, that's something that's often misunderstood. Because first off, we have to understand in a first century context, they did not have, should we say, the modern conveniences of toilet paper. So we'll just say that the left hand that was used to strike the right cheek was not always the cleanest of hands. So whereas to us in modern culture, we're all caught up with the injury that is done, but it's actually the greater thing that is done to a person by having them strike you with their left hand is the insult. And by turning the other cheek, you're not only getting struck once with the left hand, but then you're getting struck by the back of the left hand on the way back. So it is a grave, grave insult that is being done to the person who has their cheek struck. Well, the second example is another one that needs a little better understanding, because the Greek word for tunic is actually better translated as undergarments. So it is saying if somebody takes you to court and sues you for your undergarments, I don't know who would necessarily do that, but it says to give your outer garments as well. And then the third example is one from which we get go the extra mile from. Because if we talk about, the fifth station of the cross, Simon of Cyrene is conscripted to help Jesus carry the cross, which means the Roman soldiers forced him into labor. And Jesus is saying, if you are forced into labor, don't just go with them for a mile. Go a second mile. These are very, very challenging examples. And first off, they have to be understood that they are not passivity in any way. It is not just roll over and let somebody do whatever they want to you in those situations. It has to be understood in this context. The typical response to grave insult or injury, which all of these three examples are, is fight or flight. Meaning either to respond with like, But of course, at the beginning of the gospel, Jesus says, no eye for an eye. So of course, that's not what he's saying. Or the second is flight, to run away from it. But of course, we're not running away because we're turning the other cheek. So there must be a deeper meaning that Christ is calling us to in the midst of this. And it is one that, believe you me, is not in any way passivity, but is incredibly challenging. It is to return insult or injury with love. And that is a hard challenge, my brothers and sisters. Because it is, a whole lot easier to forgive somebody a couple days later once, for lack of a better phrase, your blood has stopped boiling. It is very, very hard to forgive someone in the midst of the insult that you are receiving. And for anybody that still thinks that that sounds like passivity, who was the great example of this calling? Christ. His passion. Does anybody think that Jesus on the cross dying for us was a passivity? Of course not. That's the great example of love. And what does he say on the cross? Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Even in the midst of what is being done to them, he is able to love. And that, my brothers and sisters, is what you and I are being called to today. And the beautiful thing is, the word perfect comes from the Greek word teleos, which actually is better translated as complete. So what Jesus is telling us today is that you and I must follow this in order to become complete, in order to become who you or I were created to be. And that word teleos comes from the Greek root telos, which means end or goal. And so all of this that Jesus is calling us to is saying, by following me, by loving as I love, you will be made complete. And you will achieve that goal, that end for which you are striving, heaven. And so, my brothers and sisters, you and I were called, when we get ticked off on the road, to respond with love and forgiveness. When we're sitting behind that person who's taking forever in the line in front of us, to respond with love, forgiveness, patience. That is what you and I are called to do. In the midst of our frustrations, in the midst of insults, in the midst of injuries done to our person, to respond as Christ did on the cross. And by doing so, we will be made complete and will be prepared for the gift of heaven.